Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first virtual Research and Restoration Roundtable at the Rosand Library and Study Center at Save Venice. I'm Leslie Contarini, the Venice Programs Director of Save Venice. For those of you joining us for the first time, our roundtable discussions further our mission of uniting scholarship and conservation with dialogue between conservators and scholars, and feature the latest restoration efforts of Save Venice, as well as new research being done in the fields of art history and history. As we are currently unable to gather in person for our roundtables, we will continue to offer other virtual programming throughout the spring and summer, both in English and Italian, and we very much look forward to when we can be together again. The Rosand Library and Study Center is now in its 5th year of operation, and it continues to flourish as a premier location in Venice for gathering scholars and students. We wish to thank our many donors for their continued generous support of the Rosand Library and Study Center. Today's presentation is dedicated in memory of Francis Kolarek, a founding supporter of the Rosand Library and Study Center, who recently passed away at the age of 103. We are inspired by her remarkable life, her love for Venice, and her unwavering enthusiasm and support for the Rosand Library and for Save Venice. We are pleased to honor her legacy today. Before we get started, I would just like to remind all attendees that you can submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Following the presentation, we will do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nora Gietz. Nora is an art historian and historian who specializes in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period in Venetian history. She completed her undergraduate studies in modern history at the University of Oxford before moving to the University of Warwick for her master's and doctorate in art history. She is particularly interested in how the lagoon city's artistic and architectural patrimony was affected after the fall of the 1,000-year-old Venetian Republic following the widespread dissolutions of religious institutions. Her presentation today is focused on one of Venice's perhaps lesser-known ecclesiastical landmarks, the Church of San Marziale, where Save Venice funded the conservation treatment of Jacopo Tintoretto's St. Martial in Glory altarpiece from 2017 to 2018, followed by the restoration of the 13th century Beata Vergine delle Grazie votive sculpture from 2019 to 2020. This year, Save Venice will fund the conservation of the marble altar that houses that sculpture, as well as 4 spandrel paintings by 18th century Venetian artist Julia Lama. Following Nora's presentation, we will also hear more about Save Venice's work in the church from Venice Office Director Melissa Kahn. I will now hand it over to Nora for the history, patrimony, and conservation of the Venetian Church of San Marziale.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here, even if virtually, even if this way we can probably reach more people in different parts of the world. I'm, as you see, in the Church of San Marziale, at least virtually. I'm very happy to have been invited, so thank you very much to Save Venice for your invitation. Thank you to Leslie for her kind introduction. All photos, unless it's not a photo of the Church of San Marziale itself, all photos are taken by Matteo De Fina, whom obviously we are as ever thankful to, and also by Leslie Contarini herself. So without any further ado, let's begin. The Church of San Marziale, as Leslie just also mentioned in her introduction, is one of the lesser known churches in Venice. In fact, it's a bit on the edges of the city, close to the Misericordia Fondamenta, so the kind of promenade along the Fondamenta, along the canal of the Misericordia, which is, you kind of stumble across it in a way when you move from the Strada Nuova, which is this long walkway that I'm sure most of you know, that leads from the train station towards the Rialto Bridge. And parallel to this, you find the Fondamento della Misericordia, and sort of in between is the Church of San Marziale. We will start with the history of the church and the outside of it. So as you can see from this exterior, this here is the canal of the Misericordia and the bridge that leads to the island of San Marziale. The Church of San Marziale, apart from being lesser known, is also very simple from the outside. Almost, one might not even notice it. You can see this very simple, almost sort of box-shaped single nave edifice that is very high, despite its relatively smaller kind of floor plan. And of course, this very sumptuous Baroque interior that you can see in the first slide that I shared with you and that I'm kind of sort of floating in, is very ornate. The exterior of the church, as well as the interior, is not the original. The church, in fact, is one of the older churches in Venice and probably dates back to 1133. So it's 900 years old almost. According to Francesco Sansovino, who published his famous Venezia Città Nobilissima in 1581, the church was established by the will of the Bocchi family. And possibly already in the 10th century, so 900 AD, the island itself was, the island and the whole neighborhood themselves were developed. So it's a very, despite being on the edges of Venice, like I said, in the Cannaregio Sestiere, it's actually very early on in the history of the city, and especially in the bonification of the lagoon, that the island of San Marziale is developed. It was a collegiate church for all of its history, which means that it was run by a college of priests and probably had very much direct ties to San Pietro di Castello, which obviously was the Cathedral of Venice and the see of the Patriarch of Venice, Patriarch being the Venetian title for the Bishop of Venice, and so the representative of the Pope in the city itself. So already the age of the church and also these links to the Patriarch let us assume that it must have been quite an important church that played a significant role in the society, but also in the politics of the Venetian church throughout its history. This is the aerial view of San Marziale today, obviously courtesy of Google Maps. San Marziale is just over here. Now down here is the Strada Nuova that I mentioned before with the neoclassical Church of the Maddalena, just for you to get an idea of where in Venice we are. Then the Church of Santa Fosca with the statue by Paolo Sapi, in front of it. And then this bridge that leads onto this next island before then reaching the island of San Marziale. To the left here, and this is quite important for my talk and a few other things that I will say about the history of the church and of the area. This was the area of the Servite convent in Venice. Only this chapel survives. The church of the Servites used to be here, and then one cloister is still recognizable, and the other cloister used to be here. And then this here is the fundamenta of the Misericordia with the canal, which is full of bars today. That might have been, and restaurants, which might be another reason why many of you will know the area. If we go back 500 years to Jacopo de Barbari's famous bird's eye view of Venice, we can see we can again see the Servi church so with this chapel which survives that I just showed you, and the Servi church behind it, and then the Church of San Marziale just over here. Santa Fosca that I just mentioned is here, so the statue of Paolo Sapi would be here. And immediately you can tell that the Church of San Marziale looks quite different in this view. In fact, if we go to my next slide, which puts San Marziale today and San Marziale 500 years ago, side by side, you can tell that the church was rather thinner, longer. It's possible that various sources say that the church was rebuilt on the same floor plan as the previous church. So it's likely that the apse, which you can see here, was made narrower, at least from the outside. And you can see that the church was clearly a three-nave church. So we had one higher nave in the center with two lateral naves next to it. And nowadays, it's very clearly a single nave church that leads towards this apse, the presbytery in the end. You can also tell that the church doesn't have a bell tower in 1500, and today it has this bell gable, which we'll get back to later on. And this is probably because the bell tower must have been demolished in the 15th century, so just before de Barbary made his famous view of Venice. And this might already imply the problems that the church was really facing throughout its history because of caused by decay, especially humidity, and the foundations of the church being so directly on the Misericordia Canal. This is the wellhead depicting Saint Martial of Limoges, or San Marziale in San Marciliano, or San Marziale in Venetian, on the campo, so on the square just beside the church. Sorry, I was just trying to go back. So this is the wellhead here on the campo next to the church. As you saw before, the facade goes onto quite a small and narrow street. And the campo, the square, is to the side rather than in front of the facade, which again makes it quite unusual compared to many other churches of Venice. So San Marziale, who was he? He was, as you can very much tell by his iconography, he was a bishop saint. And he was the first bishop of the French city of Limoges. It's very likely, and the most likely explanation of his kind of significance is that he was one of 7 baptized and ordinated bishops who were sent from Rome to evangelize Gaul, so to evangelize the Roman province of France at the time, under Emperor Decius around 250 AD. Now, of course, there's many various apocryphal legends that tell us all the stories and the life stories, the biographies of saints. And some of these others, they state that Saint Martial actually lived much earlier, and that he in fact could have been a direct relative of Saint Peter. Saint Peter, of course, being the Prince of the Apostles and the first Pope, and if not a direct relative, that at least he was baptized by Saint Peter himself. So this early dedication to Saint Marziale, Saint Martial in Venice, is not necessarily surprising if we think of this kind of importance that he had, at least in the very early Middle Ages. Now he becomes even more important for the Venetians in the later Middle Ages, when in 1373, on the 30th of June, which is his feast day, and it's the anniversary of his death, Venice beat at the time Padua was still independent, and they beat the Carrara family that was ruling Padua. On the same day, other Venetian troops reconquered the city of Zara in Dalmatia, and they also won a battle against the Saracens in the southern eastern Mediterranean. Now, in order to give thanks to San Marziale because of for these victories, for these military victories, the Doge of Venice on the 1st of July, 1373, decided that the feast day of Saint Martial, in fact, the day after, the 1st of July, should become a so-called Festa di Palazzo. Now, the Doge, who was the ruler of Venice, his calendar was full of these feast days, which would be celebrated by a so-called andata. The andata, which means literally to go, that the Doge would go with his signoria, who were his closest advisors. They would proceed in procession to the church whose feast day it was. Not necessarily the dedicee only of the church, but even it could be just a specific altar within that church that was being given thanks to that day. And so from 1373 onwards, the Doge once a year with his signoria would proceed to the Church of San Marziale, which again shows us that in fact it was quite an important church on the Venetian liturgical calendar, but also in the kind of political and religious awareness of the Venetians themselves. Now, the church, apart from Saint Martial, who's obviously the saint that the church is dedicated to, but he's in Venetian history, apart from the kind of political significance that I just explained, he's kind of competing in the people's adoration and worship with this sculpture of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Graces, a votive sculpture made of willow wood, which is painted and gilded, as you can see, which arrived in Venice in 1286, so almost a decade before all the military victories that I just mentioned. Now, the legend goes that this sculpture was carved out of, or sculpted out of one single log of wood by a shepherd outside the city of Rimini. Now, Rimini is just, it's now in Emilia-Romagna, now in the just south of the River Po, in the region just below the Veneto, on the Adriatic Sea. And so the shepherd, his name was Rustico, or you might translate him into Rusticus in English, the rural one, we might say. So the shepherd, as he was guarding his flock, was carved a figure of the Madonna. He was very devoted to the Madonna, and he carved this figure out of a single log of willow wood. Now, overnight, he slept next to this sculpture, and overnight demons arrived and destroyed it. Obviously, he the next morning was very much distraught, but then very quickly, very much amazed, because two angels appeared by divine will, obviously, and recarved her face in front of him. So it's a sculpture which is inspired by divine will, and then in the end is even completed by angels sent to Rusticus. Now, according to legend, this figure then performs various miracles in the city of Rimini. However, soon afterwards, it leaves Rimini, and it's not quite clear how, but apparently by itself on a boat. As you can see here, this is the cover, it's an incision on a manuscript, well, it's printed by, in the Marciana Library in Venice, which tells the legend of how the glorious image of the Madonna, of the Virgin Mary, of the Graces arrived in the Church of San Marziale after it had been shaped, or it had been created by angels in an eremo. So an eremo is where the English word is slipping my mind at the moment, but where hermits are. So in a secluded place in the city of Rimini. So, and this legend tells this entire story, how the Lady of Our Graces arrives by boat. You can see here she's coming down the Misericordia Canal, and then arrives right here outside the Church of San Marziale. As soon as the figure arrives, she's greeted by a Venetian nobility, but also by normal Venetian populace, and accompanied in procession into the church. On her way into the church, the Madonna also performs yet another miracle, and you can see them here. A father who's blind and his son who was born mute are healed, and their sight and their hearing returned to them by this votive figure. And so you can see here, obviously this is the current church, but you can see where the Madonna arrived according to legend. So of course, as soon as it is then located in the Church of San Marziale, the church becomes a great place of popular devotion and worship. So it becomes very important in Venetian lay piety. A confraternity dedicated to the Vergine delle Grazie, or the Scuola delle Vergine delle Grazie. Of course, in Venice, the confraternities are called scuole, was founded in her honor for sure by the 2nd of February 1409, but possibly as early as 1289, which of course is only 3 years after it supposedly arrived in Venice. Now, on the right here, we can see, this is another, again, it's in the Marciana. It's a 16th century oration on on this Madonna, and again explaining how she arrived in Venice herself. And you can see her collocation in the former Church of San Marziale. Now, I showed you the church and what it looked like in 1500, and you remember that it had side naves. Now, on the left lateral nave, there was specifically a chapel, which was the chapel of the confraternity dedicated to the Madonna. And you can see that it had its own altar, which was actually closed. So it was, now it's quite exposed, but you can see that it used to be enclosed in its own chapel. And it even had a kind of, almost as if, it had its own kind of retable that you could close the Madonna herself into. You can also see that, of course, it's very ornate. And of course, in Venice, it was practiced that these figures of saints, and especially the most miraculous ones, were dressed up and, and bejeweled with lots of precious jewelry and precious textiles for these specific feast days. And the same thing happened with the Madonna of San Marziale. So the confraternity had apart from the chapel, they also had their own building next to the church itself. They also contributed a lot to the upkeep of the church in the 14th and especially in the 15th century. And there seems to have even been some disagreements with the parish priest, who it almost seems as if he got quite annoyed by these brethren of the confraternity, always wanting to kind of revamp their chapel or add tombs for brethren who died, who obviously needed to be buried in the chapel of the confraternity itself. Now, and this was mentioned by Leslie in her introduction as well, Our Lady of Graces, at least the sculpture itself, has been very recently conserved by Save Venice general funds. You can see the figure here with the conservator Enrica Colombini. Again, these round tables, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are dedicated, yes, to research, but mainly, of course, to the restoration projects that Save Venice undertakes. And so obviously the more technical details, I absolutely leave to Enrica Colombini, who will be speaking to us about the conservation project of this figure very soon. Now, as always, they're very impactful, these images of artworks before and after the restorations. And you can see Our Lady of the Graces here. And you can see, obviously, on the right is her condition after the restoration. And you see how these very luscious colors, and you see how richly the figure was really painted, how they have come back to life, and how, of course, over time, as always happened, they were overpainted. Even if you look at these crowns that they had, and her gown was much more simplified compared to how originally it must have looked. So, of course, the Virgin Mary, as we're used to seeing her, she's dressed in blue to symbolize her humanity. She has this very precious golden veil. Jesus is, or the child is in a gesture of blessing, and he's wearing red, which obviously also symbolizes his divinity. So the Church of San Marziale survives the first really 5 or almost 6 centuries of its existence, with being a very central and very important church. And this is also mirrored in the fact that in 1693, it is decided completely to renovate the church. Now, this was done under parish priest Giuseppe Pasquini, who probably was so insistent to completely renovate it. In fact, it was completely demolished and pulled up again from its foundations, which is why in the beginning I said that it's very likely that the foundations are the same as of the original church. Now, there's a pastoral visit by Patriarch Bendramin, who in the 1610s, so in the early 17th century, speaks about the pastoral visits were when the Patriarch would go and visit the different parishes of Venice and look at the conditions of the churches, but also look at the pastoral life and how, the parishioners are treated, whether the sacraments are being administered, and all those things. Now, in the 1610s, Vendramin says that it's already been quite a few decades that it's been raining through the roof in the Church of San Marziale, and that especially on the left nave, so the towards the canal really, there are rotten beams which are very likely to fall down any day now. And so again, we can see, that obviously there's this danger and this damage of humidity, which is such a threat to Venetian buildings today as it was centuries ago. So between 1693 and 1714, the church was completely rebuilt, and 7 years later only, on the 28th of September 1721, a Patriarch Pietro Barbarigo, who was also cardinal, reconsecrated the new church. Okay, and this brings me on to the patrimony of the church. So to the interior itself, and the interior, the way it was created at the very beginning of the 18th century and basically largely survives to us today. So as you saw this before, and it's still the background as well behind me, you can see that the church is a single nave church with an ornate Baroque interior. There's 2 more kind of where I am basically. It has 6 altars that lead to the apse with the main altar. So the main altar, which again, you can see it's extremely Baroque, almost Rococo in style. Of course, this is the very early 1700s. The organ above the high altar, which is quite typical for Venice, really, as it emphasizes also the centrality of the music, really, in Venetian liturgy. And this idea of the music guiding the worshippers up to heaven, and to the of course the sacrament of the Eucharist that is taking place on the altar itself. Now, older sources speak of a wooden choir even in the nave itself in the former church. But this, of course, is not the case anymore today. Now, this is a floor plan, which I took from a little book that was published in 1992 by Giuliano Pavon, which to this day, unfortunately, I must say, is the only publication dedicated, or book dedicated, to the Church of San Marziale. And you can see here, you can recognize very well the floor plan that I just mentioned. So the single nave, the 6 altars, and the main chapel here. And this is again the well that I showed you at the very beginning, and the Misericordia Canal by which the Our Lady of Graces arrived in San Marziale in 1286. Now, of course, during this restoration, not only was the edifice itself rebuilt, but also all 6 altars were remade. And now we're going to concentrate on the 2 most important ones, really, and the 2 most significant also for Save Venice and the work that Save Venice has done and will be shortly doing in the Church of San Marziale. Now, Our Lady of Graces was given a new altar in the center of the church, the lateral apse where it used to be. The lateral nave obviously doesn't exist anymore at this point. It's an altar which is designed by Giovanni Comin and his workshop. The attribution is thanks to Simone Guerriero of the Cini Foundation. The altar itself is very ornate. I think it very much underlines the central importance in the kind of religious life that this figure had for not only for the parish of San Marziale, but also for Venice itself. Now, at the bottom here in the predella, and there's a nice detail here, always obviously Save Venice's own Matteo De Fina, who provided us with all these wonderful images. And you can see very clearly this bas-relief in the predella, which shows the figure of this votive figure, the sculpture of wooden sculpture of the Virgin traveling along the Adriatic from Rimini up to Venice. You can see, there's her, she's holding on to the child Jesus. Her, it's quite windy. It seems like they're going quite fast. Her veil is fluttering in the wind. And as ever, there's angels guiding her. And it almost seems like we see the forest, where this hermit shepherd Rusticus had created and had been inspired especially to create this figure. So she's leaving that to come to Venice. And I think this is very much part of the myth of Venice as well, and it's very much the importance of the Virgin Mary, of course, for the city of Venice, but also in the myth of Venice, almost this personification of Venice, always as a female figure, which, if we're being kind of neoclassical, it might be, a sort of Venus, or a combination of a Venus and the Virgin Mary, and of course also a justice. If you think of the figures of the kind of personifications of Venice, which again, it's not quite clear if it's a justice or a Venice on the facades of the ducal palace, sitting on the line of Saint Mark. So this very female personification of Venice, and and here really the Virgin Mary having this this figure of the Virgin Mary having Venice as her very clear and determined destination. So I'm now going to show you these 2 details here to the left and to the right of the predella. So just again to signpost where we are. So this one on the left here is the first miracle that the Lady of Our Graces performs in Venice, and it's the blind father. He has a stick that we saw also before in the incision in the little print, and his son who are mute, and there's a bystander kind of in awe at what is happening. And it's quite nice because we can really clearly see this bridge, which existed in the High Middle Ages as it does now, connecting the island of San Marziale to the Misericordia Fondamenta. And then on the right side of the predella, we can see, and I put side by side the kind of depiction of the image and the final image itself. We can see the angel completing this votive sculpture, and Rusticus, the shepherd who had started it the night before and who woke up horrified because demons had destroyed his work, looking on in awe from behind his tree here. And then very much above, so the tympanum above, or the gable above the altar, there's an eternal Father. And again, I think, considering that it's so high really from the viewer and so far from the viewer, again, I think the detail of it should be really remarked and underlined. And then unfortunately, this is again just to, I forgot the two angels before moving on to the next slide, but these two angels on the sides of the Madonna, I'm just going to go back. So these two angels here, this is the Eternal Father. Of course, there's many putti and other details that we could also speak about. But now the two angels on the sides, which again, extremely delicate and very, very beautiful in their sculpted marble. And then finally, and this is that what I wanted to get at is this is again, of course, the predella itself, the salt deposits that are causing very great decay in this altar. And this again, of course, shows us and reminds us all that we, of course, we're all friends of Save Venice here, but it reminds us just of how important the work that Save Venice does is, and how important it also is that it is done in the Church of San Marziale. Of course, as you all will be aware, the salt deposits of the salty waters of the lagoon, once the high water, it rises even through the, even if it doesn't get completely flooded, the water can rise, the humidity rises inside the stones of buildings, but also of altars that are made of stone. And then, of course, the water and the humidity might dry off, the water might go down, but the salt remains and crystallizes. And this, of course, causes tremendous damage to the patrimony of Venice. Now, moving on to the second very important artwork in, and maybe the most iconic, and definitely the one that you're all the most familiar with, I imagine, in the Church of San Marziale is, of course, Jacopo Tintoretto's Saint Martial in Glory with Saints Peter and Paul, which today is right opposite. So it's the two central altars in the middle of the nave in the church. So it's right opposite Our Lady of Graces. San Marziale, why do I say that it's familiar to all of you? Of course, it was restored by Save Venice between 2017 and 2018, funded by the Boston chapter of Save Venice with support from Catherine and David McRae. And it was then unveiled in 2019 for the 2018, sorry, for the 500 years of Tintoretto exhibition, which of course was a big Save Venice project, and then the exhibition in the Palazzo Ducale in the Ducal Palace in Venice, which then traveled on to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And so, of course, I think I wasn't the only one who was absolutely stunned by when I saw the San Marziale for the first time after the restoration had been completed in the Palazzo Ducale. And I think these two images here, before and after the restoration, really speak for themselves. And so this painting was created by Tintoretto in 1549. It was completed. The original signature, now Giulio Bono, who restored the painting, and Melissa Conn of Save Venice presented the restoration and all the wonderful discoveries of this restoration at the Renaissance Society of America, or RSA, exhibition in conference, in 2019. Now, this is from a previous restoration in the 1950s when the painting was relined, and the original signature on the original canvas was discovered. And I think it's quite nice because it basically tells us that Tintoretto must have signed it and so completed the painting on the vigil of Christmas, so on Christmas Eve of 1549. This is, of course, at a point when Tintoretto is finally established as a painter in Venice. Tintoretto, I mean, a few years ago, because of his 500 years, we all had ample opportunity to read and hear about him, not least because of the wonderful exhibition and catalog, of course, curated by Frederick Ilkman and Bob Eccles. Tintoretto as well, this area of Venice is very important because Tintoretto is very active in the nearby church of the Madonna dell'Orto, and of course he's also buried there. So this whole neighborhood, and also it's only a few parallel canals, we might say, where the house of Tintoretto is today. And well, today it was at the time as well. But so it's very it's not surprising in that sense that such an important work by the master is in San Marziale. Now, probably it used to be in the presbytery itself, the painting, we know that. So it used to be on the main altar before this kind of late Baroque revamping of the church. But it's likely that there were other paintings by Tintoretto because we have evidence of payments until November 1551. And also Domenico Tintoretto painted the organ shutters for the church. So it might have been, apart from Madonna dell'Orto, another very, very Tintorettesque church in Canareggio itself. So in its new altar, it was placed during this rebuilding of the church around 1700. The altar itself was by Giacomo Piazzetta. It was paid for entirely by somebody called Antonio della Vecchia Vigonza, who was a parishioner, and I believe also a member of the confraternity of the Most Holy Sacrament of San Marziale. And he states very clearly in his testament, he dies, well, the testament is dated 1629, so it's 70 years before the restoration. He states very clearly that he leaves 500 ducats, which is quite a respectable sum, really. He leaves those 500 ducats explicitly for an altar to replace the current altar of the Saint Martial in the eponymous church. Now you can see this new altar. It's again, it mirrors the altar of Our Lady of Graces in front of it, and you can see that it's quite, yeah, I mean, it's quite distracting in a way. You know, we have this wonderfully restored Tintoretto, and then this altar around it, which is extremely ornate. There's a lot going on. There's this shell. There's these figures holding the scripture above here. So it's very ornate. And in fact, as early as 1704, and again, this is Pavon published this in his book of 1992. In 1704, in the Guerro prints in the library of the Correa Museum in Piazza San Marco, of course, there's this manuscript which has a drawing of the altar. We can very much clearly recognize this. There's also these flower garlands down here. And it goes on really about how it criticizes the work, and it goes on about how horrible it is, and that it's, you know, it's really the mistakes of the architects that lead to these kind of abominations, really. The language is very, very strong, and it criticizes it remarkably. And this is quite interesting, I think, because 1700 is, of course, a time when we are maybe going slowly towards the you know, it's very late Baroque, Rococo style, but we're almost kind of it has its final sort of heyday, and maybe that's why then they make these mistakes, as this manuscript says. But then, of course, we're going towards a much more rational and neoclassical taste towards the later parts of the 18th century. Now, again, well, these are the two altars, and this is just to show you the two altars, and, you know, that are opposite each other. And also the photographs work very well together because they're exactly on scale. So you can see, of course, this kind of late medieval Madonna, Our Lady of Graces, which research has shown is possibly from the kind of Valle d'Aosta, Piemonte, so kind of the northwest of Italy, the Alpine period, not from the Adriatic, not from Rimini, and opposite the Tintoretto in these extremely ornate altars who aren't really very kind of symmetrical to each other. They're not, they're not they're not very similar in many ways. And they're both extremely ornate. But above them, we have these paintings, which are, together with the restoration of the altar, a new project for Save Venice. And these are paintings by Giulia Lama. Now, Giulia Lama was a female artist. And of course, this is always, rather rare. And she's, until Palupini and a couple of other art historians in the 20th century kind of studied her, she was very much overlooked, although there are several Venetian churches that have paintings by her. She was born in 1681. She was never a member of the Painters Guild of Venice, so she very much, she was very enigmatic in that sense, although she clearly was a professional painter and also a model for Giambattista Piazzetta, so the painter Piazzetta. She was never part of the Painters Guild. And the few things that we know about her, she must have been quite an interesting character. Now, her paintings are extremely expressive, very, this kind of chiaroscuro. So again, it's quite interesting, of course, together with Tintoretto. And I personally can't wait to see them kind of restored to all their glory together with the altar pieces below. So Giulia Lama, above each of these two altars that I've been speaking about, painted the four evangelists, probably around 1720. So it's very likely that this was done just before the reconsecration of the church in 1721. So this is, of course, you might recognize it still, the altar of San Marzion. And you can see that there's above, there's St. Luke and St. John. I'm just showing you the details. Of course, they each have their attributes. The evangelists, we always see them writing. St. Luke has the ox or bull next to him. Then there's St. John, of course, with his eagle. And then we move on to the altar of Our Lady of Graces with Saint Mark. I mean, these are even, and again, this wall is obviously, you saw the damage in the altar itself. And these are even more difficult to recognize than the other two paintings. But we have Saint Mark and Saint Matthew. Again, a detail here, of course, Saint Mark, the patron saint of Venice, with the ubiquitous lion, who's basically very difficult even to recognize, but he's right here. And then next to him, we have Saint Matthew with this winged angel, his usual attribute. Okay. At the same time, or even earlier, but during the same restoration, Sebastiano Ricci painted the ceiling. So again, you can see that it was a complete overhaul of the church. There are still some other, of course, also in the other four altars and also on the walls and in the sacristy, there are still some of the former paintings that were in the church, but the interior was completely redone during this restoration. So in these three canvases, we have two paintings relating to Our Lady of Graces and the center, which is again St. Martial. I'm just going to show them to you in detail. So this is the Angels Sculpting, and again, especially you can see the face of the of Our Lady of Graces. You can see Rusticus or Rustico here, and one angel who's defeating the demons. Now there's a sort of Satan kind of figure down here who's being beaten by this angel. Then the other roundel represents Our Lady arriving in Venice. So you can see again, guided by angels. It's literally just about to come off the boat, right here by the Church of San Marziale. What's interesting in these two is that it's not painted. The sculpture itself is not painted. And of course, we don't know what moved Ricci towards this kind of pictorial decision, but I think it's at least noteworthy. And then in the center, in the ceiling, there's Saint Martial in glory and an Eternal Father in above the main altar. This is the organ, and this is the Christ the Redeemer above the main altar. Now, I think it's very interesting to remark that in 1700, they basically recreated, and this is 600 years into the history of the church, they centered this kind of restoration of the church, but also the commissioning of Sebastiano Ricci's and then later Giulia Lama's paintings as and especially Ricci's, as a kind of complete decorative program that adds to and completes the Saint Martial and, of course, Our Lady of Graces in the iconography that was chosen. So, of course, the Saint Martial here in glory, again, just like the Tintoretto, recalls Tintoretto's paintings, and then these two roundels that show the legend of the votive sculpture of the Madonna, which of course recalls the bas-reliefs in the altar itself. So it's a very kind of complete and very concise, I think, design of a kind of coherent pictorial program. So, and now I'm coming towards the end. So what happens next? In 1721, the new church is reconsecrated, but of course that's only 76 years before the fall of the Venetian Republic at the hands of Napoleon Bonaparte, who at this point is still only General-in-Chief of the French Army of Italy during the wars of the French Revolution. Now, the Grand Council of the Venetian Republic abdicates in May 1797. I always like to show this Pulcinella, the figure of, this is a Tiepolo, of the Commedia dell'arte, waving goodbye to Venice. And again, of course, I kind of chose it also on purpose because it depicts one of these female personifications and female depictions of Venice herself. And again, we have, the way the votive Madonna arrives by canal, Venice herself is leaving after the fall of the Republic, and of course, after the end of Venetian independence that lasted, 1,000 years. And of course, in how many days? In 8 days, Venice is turning 1,600 years old, because the legendary date of birth of Venice, I think I said Save Venice, I meant Venice is turning 1,600, Save Venice is turning 50, but the legendary birth of Venice is on the 25th of March, so the day of the Annunciation of 421. So again, Venice is directly relating herself to the Virgin Mary and the Annunciation. So again, it all comes together, and it shows how important really, I think, San Marziale must have been to the Venetians throughout the most parts of Venetian history. And today, we can hardly go and see the church because it always seems to be closed, which is of course a great shame. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail now because I'm also aware of the time. But of course, there's a democratic government in Venice in 1797, 1798. Then Venice is ruled by the Austrians for a few years after Napoleon sells, infamously, they always use the word sells Venice to the Austrians. In 1806, Venice becomes part of the Napoleonic Empire. In 1807, Napoleon visits Venice for the only time as emperor. Of course, he's emperor of the French by now. And Napoleon declares a law for Venice. They call it a law for Venice in December 1807, right at the end of his visit. And apart from many different things, he decrees that the Venetian parishes should be decreased, so they should be rationalized. He also institutes, for example, the cemetery on the island of San Michele, but obviously we're looking at the parishes now. So the parishes get decreased from 70 that Venice has to 40. In 1808, there's a long series of documents where they speak about, they look at all the different parishes that exist, And they obviously have the parish of San Marziale, and they say it has about 2,000, a population of about 2,000 people. But then they somehow forget about San Marziale. There's actually a document that I came across in March 1808, where they say, okay, these are the 40 parishes, but San Marziale isn't in there because we forgot about it. And I think there's a bit of a problem because they're not quite sure what to do with the Servi. And I think this is very interesting because the Servi is the Frari and San Giovanni and Paolo, they survive, although they were regular clergy convent churches. The Servi of the Servites, big, it has 22 altars apparently, as you'll see in a moment. Maybe it should survive, but somehow there's clearly an understanding here and an awareness that San Marziale is actually very important to Venice and important to the Venetians. So this is San Marziale here, and this is the Servi. These are again the same slides that I showed you in the beginning. So then in 1810, the Servi gets suppressed. There's a second round of suppressions. The confraternities suppressed, parishes decreased. In 1810, there's a general suppression where all the convents and monasteries that hadn't been suppressed get suppressed. And the Servi this time also gets suppressed. And it's announced that the parishes need to be decreased from 40 to 30. So there's this competition now between the Servi and the San Marziale. So one of the documents says that the Servi is a vast church with 22 altars. There's paintings by the Tintoretto family, but we have that in San Marziale as well, by the Libera, by other painters. And it would deserve to become a parish church, but that would mean obviously suppressing San Marziale. That would become a subsidiary church in this parish of the Servi. This is what happens to San Polo, that becomes part of the parish of the Frari. And then we see later on that San Marziale is chosen as the parish, and the Servi actually get completely demolished because, as you can see, the church itself, we can see where the church was, but it's not there anymore. It falls into decay, it's sold, and then it's slowly demolished. And so San Marziale survives as a parish and collegiate church. They then always say what are the most note and praiseworthy attributes because of architecture and painting or the location of a church, why it should be conserved, preserved. Of course, this is a big question. How do they rationalize? How do they? What's the rationale behind the churches that get preserved? But they don't mention anything specific or anything peculiar or special about San Marziale. They just say it's sufficient and well preserved, and that it has a population of around 2,000. And so then in the end, it survives as a parish church. This is Paganuzzi, there's whole plans of Venice, maps of Venice, and he shows the 30 parishes of Venice, how they survive after the Napoleonic interval, and obviously also into the Austrian domination again, at last until Venice joins the Italian kingdom. And this is the parish of San Marziale. Now, San Marziale remains a parish church until 1876. And in 1876, it becomes part of the parish of the Madonna dell'Orto. And here the circle kind of comes complete because Madonna dell'Orto, of course, because of its significance for Tintoretto, I have already mentioned it, and it's very close by. But this is why San Marziale today, I think, despite its very fascinating history and despite its very elaborate and interior with very important and very much venerated artworks, is so much overlooked in Venice today, both I think socially and culturally and but also artistically. Okay, so this is where I would end. Obviously, I'm here for questions, and I'm sorry if I was a bit longer than I had anticipated in the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora, for your excellent presentation. I'm sorry you couldn't be with us in the Rosand Library, but I do look forward to the future when we can continue talking about Save Venice projects. And thank you so much for mentioning all Save Venice's work in San Marziale. We started in 2014 when we first came to look at the Tintoretto altar, with the Boston chapter taking that on, and it became such an important work and really made all of us think about the Church of San Marziale, and being able to continue with Our Lady of the Graces, such an essential artistic piece of the church and the iconography. So we'll be beginning this summer on the altar of Our Lady of the Graces, the Giovanni Comine. And as you noted, those problems with the rising damp and the salt are really notable. The entire altar will be dismantled, and we'll go through a desalinization process, and will really make a tremendous difference. And then, of course, it's very exciting to start with the Giulia Lama paintings, with the 4 of them. They'll be taken to the Scuola dei Mercanti near the Madonna dell'Orto for the restoration treatment. And that, again, will bring so much more attention to this outstanding female artist who hasn't been very well understood. So if anyone who's watching would like to know more about these projects, you can look at our Save Venice website. And also, we have sponsorship opportunities available. I'd like to thank already Donna Malin, who has adopted St. Matthew of the Giulia Lama series, but we have other opportunities for sponsorship. And if you're interested in San Marziale, please do contact any of us. I know there is one question about the accessibility of San Marziale. And I guess I can maybe answer that it is looked after by the Church of Madonna dell'Orto. And so there are masses held at San Marziale in the evening at 6:30 and on Sunday by the priest from Madonna dell'Orto. There is interest in keeping it open more often. And we at Save Venice hope that through our continued conservation campaigns there, bringing more attention to the important artistic monuments there, that there will be more of a move to keep it open on a regular basis. And so I'm quite confident that we will see a difference in San Marziale as we continue to preserve the artworks. Okay. There's another maybe question about the Napoleonic suppressions. If you sort of, how many churches suffered in that way? Do you think of other examples like San Marziale, churches that are forgotten or put aside because of those changes after the fall of the Republic?
Well, like I said, I mean, the aim is really to rationalize Venice and to decrease the parishes as much as possible, because the Napoleonic regime was very much suspicious of the role that confraternities, and especially also the kind of convents and monasteries, so the religious orders, played in people's lives. So the way that they kind of infiltrated people, the society, and also people's kind of piety, and this kind of popular piety that was very much part of, I mentioned all the different andate and everything. And also in San Marziale, the 2nd of July, I just realized I forgot to mention, but the 2nd of July, which until the Second Vatican Council, until 1969, was the day of the Visitation of the Madonna. And so the Visitation, of course, which is when the Virgin Mary visits Saint Elizabeth, who's pregnant with Saint John the Baptist. And for, just as an example, in San Marziale, they would celebrate for 8 days before the 2nd of July and for 8 days after. And then, of course, there was also the Doge who would arrive on the 1st of July because of this coincidence of these military victories on the day of Saint Martial. And, these kinds of things they were completely suspicious of, and they hated it really. And it was seen as superstitious. And as popular superstition and very widespread superstition. And so so any religious orders that were not educational or looked after the sick were suppressed. All confraternities, we have the Scuole Grandi, San Rocco survives, and the Carmini survive. All the other Scuole Grandi that exist at the end of the Republic get suppressed. All, in most Venetian churches that we see, each altar was a confraternity altar, and each of those, the scuole piccole, that they had the confraternities, but they also have the buildings. For example, the San Giorgio dei Schiavoni with the Carpaccio paintings that I know Save Venice was obviously involved with. So dedicated to a specific saint, dedicated to a specific nation, dedicated to a specific job even. There was probably 700 of them. All of those were suppressed. Now the ones dedicated to the Most Holy Sacrament, which each parish church had, those were reopened, but of course all their goods were appropriated by the state. And so in Venice, except for, you know, all the different, there's about 39, off the top of my head, I can think of 39 convents and monasteries that get closed. You know, there's things like on the island of Murano, for example, you know, the glass island, there's on one occasion, there's something like 492 paintings that I came across a document of. These 492 paintings get moved away from the island to be sold at auctions. And this is, of course, also to make money for the Napoleonic Empire, and also to make money for all the different wars. And so I mentioned San Polo, which, you know, again, San Polo, like San Marziale, was a very, very important parish church in Venice, and very much part of the you know, it's very rich, and also in terms of the kind of merchants that lived there, very important area. And that church, you know, was, and they even had just restored it in 1800, and that was completely, that was, you know, although it was newly restored, it was closed down, and it became part of the, at least the church survived, but it became part of the Frari. And so there's I mean, yes, as you can tell, I could go on. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think it's a huge amount of churches, and not only of churches, but of artworks that get affected by it, and that in many ways don't play the role in Venetian life anymore the way they used to in those past 200 years since then.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. What are the specific iconographical attributes of the Madonna delle Grazie, of the Our Lady of Graces?
Okay, shall I put the slide back up?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, here it is. Well, I think it's a very, it's probably, like it was said, you know, it's probably North Italian, although it's not quite sure. Of course, the origins are probably legendary. It's, of course, it's a Virgin Mary enthroned with the Christ child. You know, you can see, of course, already they're both, apart from enthroned, they're both wearing crowns. You can already see the kind of, you know, obviously the destiny, I might say, of the Passion of Christ, and Christ as, you know, he's already indicating that his kind of divinity, not only because he's dressed in red, but also there's this kind of blessing, you know, this blessing, this gesture of the, you know, with the fingers, which we see in many Christ the Redeemers. And I think also the Christ figure that we kind of saw a bit in the one Sebastiano Ricci that's on top of the main altar in San Marziale, I think also uses this gesture with his hands. The Virgin Mary in blue, which again is of celestial, but also her humanity, and the gilding of the cloth itself, which is all obviously their regality. And I think that's those are the main ones, at least that I right now recognize. I don't know, Leslie, if you have anything to add, maybe.
Yeah, during the conservation, the conservator uncovered some of the painted details around the base, kind of a Byzantine style architecture, and also some faux jewels painted onto the throne as well.
Right, and since the statue dates to about 1290 or so, and it is unusual that we had to remove a cork insert, that you can see the difference in the figure, where it was basically maybe a change in style, a change in fashion, that this during conservation, we're not sure when her bodice was completely modified. So it is quite remarkable being able to go back to the much more original outline of the figure of this late 13th century piece.
Yeah, I think that's also why these jewels and things, they are quite Yeah, they are quite Byzantine, I guess. And I suppose it's when they, which is why also the original, no, it looks much more northern in a way than maybe it looks now. But it's definitely a fascinating work. And I think it also, again, it goes back to all these processions, no, and to these feast days and that were happening and that were celebrated in Venice and throughout Venice. Basically every day of the calendar there was some kind of a feast fest, and people would go and dress these, especially the miraculous figures, no, the kind of statues and sculptures. And so, it seems that those might be remains, from that practice. And again, it's something that I come across a lot, because when, of course, during the Napoleonic suppressions, when they advocate, appropriate a confraternity, they make inventories, no, because of course they appropriate all the property. And so in the inventories of the confraternities, you often get long lists of jewels and cloths and textiles and clothes that were clearly used to dress these figures at different times during the liturgical year.
Okay. Well, we didn't have time to get to all of your questions, but for those of you who did send them our way, we will be in touch by email to hopefully answer those after today's presentation. So I just wanted to thank our presenter, Nora Gietz, again, and also thank you, Melissa Kahn, for going over Save Venice's projects in the church. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have future virtual programming coming up later this spring, so stay tuned, and we'll be sending out the details about those very soon. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.